Here we go. Welcome to another Zeteo town hall. We're calling this a breaking news town hall, given the impending full-scale, horrific Israeli invasion of Rafah that is basically happening as we speak. People are being killed in greater numbers. Netanyahu, if you're following the news right now, is saying that any hostage deal proposed in Cairo that Hamas have accepted is not acceptable to Israel, falls far short, he says. And the UN Secretary General has come out today, just before we started this town hall, saying a full-scale invasion of Rafah would be a catastrophe. But hey, who listens to the UN Secretary General these days? Two people we should listen to are my panel today, who we've invited to help enlighten us on what's going on in the Middle East and here at home in the United States. Let me introduce our panelists today. Segal is a professor of Holocaust and genocide studies at Stockton University, and Diana Buttu is a Palestinian lawyer based out of Israel, former advisor to the PLO negotiating team, and now a Zeteo contributor, I'm delighted to say. Let's get going and talk about the urgent news right now, which is what's happening in Rafah. Diana, what do you think is going on in Rafah right now with the Israeli assault? Was this always the plan? The hostages were a sideshow? Is the deal not up to scratch that Hamas signed on to, that the Qataris and the Egyptians and the CIA helped negotiate? Is this Netanyahu protecting his domestic political flank because his coalition partners will screw him if he agrees to any kind of hostage deal? Is this him trying to stay out of prison? What is this?
Well, first of all, thanks very much, Mehdi, and it's really a delight to be here with you, and a delight to be with you too, Raz. Look, it's hard not to look at this assault on Rafah as being something that Netanyahu always wanted. He's made it clear since the beginning that they were going to continue to push Palestinians further south, south, south. At the beginning, it was push them south below Wadi Gaza. Then it was further south into Deir al-Balah, then further south into Khan Yunis. And now, of course, as they put it, the inevitable of Rafah. And the point is very clear that they want to get rid of Palestinians. It's both an ethnic cleansing and a genocide. Could it be avoided? Absolutely. But nobody has given Netanyahu the red light. To the contrary, they've given him the green light, whether it's through his coalition or through the Biden administration. All that he's seen is that it's much better for him to go ahead and pursue this disastrous ground invasion rather than anything else, because he really just has not seen anything more. He knows that the minute that that this genocide is over, that this attack on Gaza is over, is the moment that he's no longer going to be prime minister. And he knows that he may also face prison as well. By the way, not from an international court, but from an Israeli court.
Well, we'll find out about international court very soon. We just broke a story on Zeteo yesterday about the arrest warrants that are believed to be coming from the International Criminal Court that has the Israelis and their American allies so worried that 12 Republican senators wrote a letter to the ICC chief prosecutor, which we obtained and published yesterday, in which they say, if you target Israel, we will target you. You have been warned. So they are worried about arrest warrants. Just before I go to Raz, let me just tell all of you in the chat, and there are literally hundreds of you are watching this call. We appreciate you joining us in the middle of the day here in the US. Please do post your questions in the chat. I'll try and get through as many as I can. I've got questions of my own, you'll be shocked to hear. But I'll try and get through as many as I can. There's a lot of you, so forgive me if I don't get to your question. I see Michael Connors has one. We're coming to that, Michael, in a moment. Raz, I do want to talk a lot to you about the G word, about genocide, your field of study, how I first came across you shortly after October 7th when you wrote the piece for Jewish Current saying this is a textbook case of genocide. We'll come to that. But just on what Diana said about Rafah, what do you make of what's going on in Rafah?
I think it's a clear indication now. We're all seeing that one of the two declared Israeli goals of its attack on Gaza, the hostages, right? The other is the destruction of Hamas. Was never a real goal, because here the Israeli government was now given an opportunity really of a release of all the hostages and also receiving back bodies of people who were killed, and rejected the deal, as was anticipated that Netanyahu would do. So now I think we can all be clear on the fact that returning the hostages, and this is horrible, of course, for the hostages themselves and for their families struggling in Israel, but returning the hostages was never a goal of this attack on Gaza.
And those of us who said that were attacked as conspiracy theorists or cynics or whatever it is. But it's now plain as day that the deal And anyone who looks at the details of the deal that were developed on Sunday, which the Israelis were on board with until Hamas called their bluff and agreed to it, and then Israel was like, oh, we don't agree to this deal. This is a different deal. That deal allows for the release of every single hostage that's believed to be in custody. It's a separate issue whether Hamas can find the hostages, God forbid, how many are dead. But civilian and military, Hamas agreed to release all of them in return for Palestinian detainees / hostages on the Israeli side. Diana, what do you make of Joe Biden's positioning on this? Because Michael Connors has a question. Let's bring in a first question from our audience. Can you explain Biden's bear hug strategy and its failures? And of course, you mentioned earlier there's no red light from the United States. But Diana, Joe Biden said in an interview, this is my red line. Going into Rafah is a red line. Benjamin Netanyahu is just stepping all over that red line.
Right. Well, he said there was a red line, and then he backtracked and said, well, maybe I wasn't so sure about there being a red line. It's hard to understand his bear hug strategy, to be quite honest. If you look at the polls, the vast majority of Democrats are not in support of this. And of course, the world isn't in support of this genocide either. And yet you continue to see that this massive bear hug is being given by Biden that is continuing to fuel, foster, fund this genocide. This isn't just a question of diplomatic support, but it's financial support and it's military support as well. And so it's hard not to view this as both Israel and the United States carrying out genocide against Palestinians. It's impossible not to view it in any other way.
Okay, we're into the genocide discussion. Raz, let me ask you this. You came out shortly after October 7th. You did a Guardian piece. You did a Jewish Currents essay. You even put together a petition of something like 800 scholars, if I remember, that you were involved in, saying, we're worried about genocide. Genocide is unfolding. We're on the verge of genocide. In your view, you said the rhetoric was textbook case from the Gallants and the Katzes, the Israeli cabinet ministers, who were saying stuff like, cut off all electricity, etc. Where are we 7 months later? If you could say in October 2023 you thought it was genocidal then, given what's happening in Rafah now and Diana's comments a moment ago, I mean, is it genocide plus right now? Where are we in May of 2024?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's important to say that already on 13th of October, when I published that piece in Jewish Currents, I mean, the direct and unashamed and explicit genocidal rhetoric of intent to commit genocide. And intent in the convention, as we know, is the thing that's most difficult to prove usually. Not in the Israeli case, right? I mean, Law for Palestine has documented now hundreds of cases of genocidal rhetoric. Most of them are actually incitement to genocide, right, which is a different crime. But there's also dozens of people with command authority, that is state leaders, war cabinet ministers, and senior army officers, who have expressed intent to commit genocide, and not only in the heat of the moment, right, in the week after 7th of October, but I mean, I can just say, I don't know if people are aware that a week ago, Bezalel Smotrich, right, the settler Minister of Finance, who's also the de facto governor of the occupied West Bank.
Total annihilation, he said, right? Total annihilation of Gaza.
Exactly, yeah. He talked about total annihilation, right? He prefaced this, actually, it was a holiday lunch with moments before redemption. So this is, I mean, we're in the realm of full-scale genocidal rhetoric well after 7th of October, after the ICJ provisional ruling in late January, after another round of provisional measures of the ICJ in March, and then all the rumors around the ICC. We're still seeing the genocidal rhetoric. Now, that, I published the piece because as a scholar of the Holocaust, of the Jewish world, as a Jew and an Israeli, right? I mean, if there's at least a risk of genocide, which clearly there already was on 13th of October, right, because of the genocidal rhetoric and the dynamics of violence that we were already seeing on the ground, then that means that already activates actually the convention, right? And that means that we need to do something, right, whatever it is. Now, almost 7 months later, right, we're clearly witnessing an unfolding genocide. It's important to say in that sense, and because we know that it's not about the hostages now, right? Then what is the attack about? Well, it's about destroying the Palestinians of Gaza, right? That's what the attack is about. And Israel could now invade Rafah and continue because it still enjoys this kind of level of impunity that we see also from the US government. And in relation to what you said just before, Diana, I think it's important to recognize that what we're facing here now is a challenge to the whole white supremacist kind of system of the West, right? Because if we finally recognized Israel for what it is, which is a white supremacist settler state, right? Then the problem is that it's not just confined to that, right? We have to recognize the whole system behind it, its support, its allies, including white supremacy and settler colonialism in the US, and who wants to go there, right? So this is where...
Raz, let me ask you this. I was on Piers Morgan's show last week, and I mentioned the Bezalel Smotrich line about total annihilation. I said, do you agree with that? Is that not genocidal? And he said, oh, it's borderline genocide. It's borders on genocide. He couldn't bring himself to say it's genocidal. Do you come up against that resistance to describe what Israel's doing as genocidal? Because it's Israel, right? Because you can't accuse the Jewish state of doing a genocide when Jews were victims of the biggest genocide in history. There is this sense, and it's been pushed by supporters of Israel, by Israeli ministers, spokespersons, the Elon Levy's of this world, who say, if you accuse Israel of genocide, that's a blood libel. I'm sure you get that a lot. And you're an Israeli, so you get it a lot.
Yeah, of course. I mean, my position here is clear. There's a clear difference between a state and a people, right? So that's it. Jews are a people. Israel is a state. Israel is capable of everything that any other state is capable of, including, as we're seeing now in front of our eyes, genocide. But I want to say something about the issue of the rhetoric, because according to the convention, by the way, we need intent, but we also need the dynamics of violence, right? And what we're seeing actually since October, right, we see this connection between the intent as expressed, right, and the dynamics of destruction on the ground. And we see it mostly, and I want to say here, also relevant to what's happening now in Rafah, in the weaponization of international humanitarian law with these safe routes and safe spaces, right? Because we know, even the New York Times published a big investigative piece on the fact that after the first evacuation order, the largest, most destructive bombs that Israel has, US made, of course, were used. The 2,000-ton bombs were used in the south, where Israel told Palestinians to flee. We know from testimonies of Palestinians, that is, these text messages and voice messages after 7th of October, that people actually fled to the south and then fled back to the north because of the intensity of these bombardments in the south and on the safe routes, right, where a lot of people died on routes that Israel designated as safe. So this is this weaponization of international humanitarian law, not in order to ensure the safety of the civilian population, but actually to target it more effectively, right? And if you consider the total siege, right, with that, right, then of course we have, and the destruction of the medical infrastructure, the cutting off of food, water, essentials for life, right, then we do have in the language of the convention, the creation of conditions calculated to bring about the destruction, the physical destruction of the group in whole or in part. That's what we're seeing, and that's what we're now seeing in the further invasion of Rafah, which I hope will actually be very, very limited, but there's a clear danger now that this is, you know, the next and final stage, as it were, of the destruction of Gaza.
Yes, indeed. Please do put your questions in the chat. We'll try and get through some of them. Ben Turner asks, Diana, what kind of legal implications, both internationally as well as in Israel, might be forthcoming when the war ends?
Well, nothing's going to happen inside Israel. I think it would be foolhardy to suggest that Israeli courts are going to give any form of justice to Palestinians. As a lawyer who's been active here, I can tell you that the courts have never provided any justice to Palestinians, because these are laws that are stitched together to support the state. They're not stitched together to support Palestinians in any way, shape, or form. That's the essence of an apartheid state, is to have a legal system that continues to support the apartheid. Internationally, however, there can be a lot of action done, and this is where our work becomes very important. The international legal system is actually not very strong. It's a weak legal system, and it requires actions by states in order for these laws to be implemented. But states are not just states, they're also the people that make up the states. And this is why it's so important for people to be pushing for Israel to be held to account through sanctions, through boycott, through divestment. These are things that can be done both on the state level, but also on a grassroots level. And that's why the initial ruling by the ICJ, the Provisional Measures ruling, was so important, because it should be leading to people pushing to isolate Israel, to hold Israel accountable, to push for divestment, to push for sanctions, and to be pushing, obviously, for boycotts as well. Beyond that, the work then becomes that other states also have to hold Israel account by making sure that there are no arms that are sent to Israel, because it's clear that it doesn't know how to behave responsibly, and that Israel be isolated, just as other countries around the world have been isolated.
Raz, Diana mentioned the ICJ Provisional Measures. I'm sure you saw the BBC interview recently with the former president of the ICJ, the American judge, former State Department lawyer under Hillary Clinton, who went out of her way to throw some of her fellow justices under the bus and say, well, we didn't say it was a plausible genocide. That's media misreporting. What we really said was that the Palestinians have a plausible right not to be genocided. Put aside the legal technicalities of the distinction between those two things. I'm sure you got a lot of pushback from people saying, see, it's not a genocide.
Yeah, I mean, I think that what we saw, I mean, that actually the jurisprudence about this and the history of the ICJ is not clear, right? In terms of the distinction that she made there, but it's, you know, there's other judges, as you said, right? And we've heard this only from her. And you know, to me, the difference that she noted is there is no difference there, right? I mean, there is what the court said is that it can move forward, right? Because there is a plausible case, right? And it actually cited the genocidal statements, right? Yep. And it noted, actually, it accepted South Africa's argument about the weaponization of international humanitarian law that was raised in the initial hearings, right? So I don't really, you know, to me, what this was a clear attempt to kind of reproduce impunity, right? Or at least the atmosphere of impunity where, you know, like, let's step back. We're still, you know, it's not clear what's going on, even though it's absolutely clear to everyone who's has eyes in his head, right?
And from the one judge on the panel who just coincidentally happens to be the only former US government employee on the panel. Let me bring in, actually, Raz, I've got a question for you from, on the US. Abdullah Zini asks, given that Israel's younger generation is skewing harder and harder to the right, while their counterparts in the US, I assume you mean young Jews in the US, skew leftwards, what does the future hold for the US-Israel special relationship in the aftermath of all of this?
My God.
Big question. But I think that's an interesting observation about young Israelis are pretty right-wing compared to young Jews in America. I think it's fair to say.
No, I said my God because we're coming very fast towards November here, and you know, who knows what that will bring here in the U.S. I mean, I think that the key, there's clearly you know, a lot of younger Jews, but not only younger Jews in the U.S. I mean, there's a clear disconnect, right? More and more Jews in the U.S. are saying, you know, there's I think interestingly we're seeing a new an identity in the Jewish world that's coming back that was once actually very prevalent, which is non-Zionist. So not Zionist or anti-Zionist, but non-Zionist. You know, I'm a Jew in the world and just leave me alone, right? I mean, I don't because more and more people are understanding that this is crazy. You know, I don't want actually anything to do with it. It actually puts me in danger in various ways, as we're seeing, right? But I just want to echo what Diana said, that I think now with this move to the left that you're noting here, right? One of the clear things that everyone can do and that the ICJ provisional rulings helps us do on various levels is work towards BDS, towards divestment and boycott and sanctions. That's the most important thing, actually. I would say that's also what's happening in the encampments, right? That's the clear demands of the students in the encampments on U.S. campuses, right? Disclose and divest, right? Because we know, as Diana said, that this genocidal assault on Gaza, Israel can do it only because of U.S. support. That's it. If that's end, the genocide ends.
Raz, it's so funny that you mentioned the clear demands from the protesters, because our elite media keep reporting that we don't know what they want. They won't talk to us. They won't tell us. It's so confusing. And the Atlantic has a big piece about mixed messaging from the press. It's pretty clear when you go to the websites of the CUAD and others at Columbia that it is about divestment. It is about a ceasefire. While I've got you, Raz, quick follow-up from... Have I lost the question? A quick question from, where's it gone? Somebody had a question. I can't forget the name. I'll find it. But have you had backlash, if I remember the question correctly, from Israelis, fellow Jews, for your position on this conflict, for your use of the genocide word? Or have you had some support or praise from people quietly behind the scenes?
I've had both. So, of course, most of the hate mails, and I've received quite a lot of that after 13th of October, comes from Israelis, right? But I have to say that I've also received a lot of support from Israelis, and actually Jews around the world. People have written to me and actually identified as children or grandchildren of Holocaust survivors. I've even had some survivors themselves write to me, Holocaust survivors. And I'd say it's about 50-50, just, you know, very broadly saying about support or versus hate mail. So it's not, you know, there's no clear picture here, even among Israelis. I mean, a lot of hate mails and a lot of anger, and but there's also a lot of support and some sincere willingness to dialogue and talk.
And Diana's written a brilliant piece on this, which I do want to come to. But before we get to that, just sticking with Rafah, Paul Weinberg, Diana asks, what is the role of Egypt? And by the way, that last question was from John Ray to Raz. Thank you, John. Paul Weinberg asks, what is the role of Egypt in a full invasion of Rafah? Will it affect any of the treaties between Egypt and Israel? What about the Palestinians crossing into the Sinai from Gaza in the event of an attack on Rafah?
Well, the Israelis have closed down the Rafah crossing point, so it's impossible for people to get out. Look, the Egyptians have said that they don't want to make it easy on Israel to ethnically cleanse Gaza, and that has been their primary reason for closing down Rafah. That being said, we do see that it was open before and that there were companies, there was an Egyptian company that had made millions of dollars off of Palestinians who were desperate to flee. Some of them paying upwards of $8,000 for an adult and $5,000 for a child, just to be able to get on the list to end up leaving to go to Egypt with numerous conditions. That being said, now the Rafah border crossing is closed. The Israelis just announced earlier, just before we began, that they're going to limit their operations in Rafah. I don't believe it. But in terms of Egypt, look, I think that if anything, it's not just Egypt, but it should be a coalition of a number of countries that are coming out and saying enough is enough. We cannot continue to have relations with Israel, given that it continues to pursue this genocide. It's not just on Egypt, it's not just on Jordan, but on all of the countries that we see, and in particular, the European countries, America, etc. And because otherwise, it's, again, giving the green light to genocide.
Raz, Robert Helling asks, do you think it is the goal of the Israeli state, at least in part, to ethnically cleanse the Gaza Strip and settle new settlers there, basically do a population swap? Well, it's not quite a swap because they won't be coming to Israel. Would that cross a line for the international community that has positioned itself against the settling in Gaza? But we saw how toothless the world was when it comes to stopping Israel.
Yeah, I mean, that's, on 13th of October, by the way, we had a leaked document from Israel's Ministry of Intelligence, yes, right, outlined a plan to ethnically cleanse Gaza completely and remove all the Palestinians to the Sinai Desert across the border with Egypt. Now, I mean, I have to say this. What we're seeing now, it didn't have to happen, right? Israel's history, like any history, is not deterministic. But Israel's founding ideology, right, of Zionism, the way that it was founded in the 1948 war in the Nakba, right, is to create an ethno-national Jewish state, right, with as many Jews as possible and as few Palestinians, and ideally with no Palestinians, actually, right? What we're now seeing is the ethnic cleansing, right? That what Israel Minister Avi Dichter, right, part of the war cabinet, by the way, described in November as the Gaza Nakba openly. Right, this is what we're seeing now. I want to even add to that more, right? That we know that many Israelis in the government today, the settlers in the government, but others as well, right, are looking towards ethnic cleansing in the West Bank, which is already happening, by the way, right? Of course, we know that it's happening. It's intensified since 7th of October, and there's a clear danger, right, that this will intensify further. So if we're talking about prevention, by the way, genocide prevention of violence, we should be looking at the West Bank, we should be looking at occupied East Jerusalem, we should also be looking at Palestinians and Israelis, actually the Palestinian citizens of Israel, which are in grave danger because arguably they're the most dangerous enemies, the enemies within, right? So yes, absolutely, that's the goal. The goal is to destroy Gaza, remove all the Palestinians there, put in settlements. We're already seeing people in the Israeli government work towards that very practically.
So a couple of quick things. I think, just to correct you, I think Avi Dichter is not a member of the war cabinet, but he is in the cabinet and he is a former head of Shin Bet. So we should take seriously when he says Nakba 2023, we're doing it again. That's a real problem. I also find it amusing when I quote Ben Gvir or Smotrich and people say to me, well, they're not in the war cabinet, they're just in the cabinet. As if, can you imagine if like Gina Raimondo, the commerce secretary, said, kill all the Jews. And Biden said, well, she's only the commerce secretary. She's not the defense secretary. It's a very weird kind of grading on a curve of the Israeli cabinet. You can say genocidal stuff if you're like in the lower tier of the cabinet. Anyways, before I get distracted, Robert Helling, who asked that question, also said, there's a nice segue for us, Diana's piece, I just read Diana's piece for Zeteo. It was incredibly interesting, but it made me think about her safety. Does Diana feel unsafe in her daily life? How does it affect her doing her job? Diana, you wrote this fantastic first column for us, monthly diary out of Haifa Haifa. It came about from when I met you a few weeks ago, and you were telling me about how when you go to the supermarket, you see eggs saying we all stand together, and you see your neighbors saying we must finish them. And it was a sense of, we don't really hear about the Palestinian perspective, 1/5 of the population of Israel, too much in the West, or even in the Middle East, to be honest, even amongst kind of people talk about Palestinians in Gaza and the West Bank, but don't talk about Palestinians in Israel. Just deal with Robert's point about your daily life, but also tell us about that quote unquote genocide fever that you talk about in your column amongst your neighbors' everyday life.
Yes, genocide fever is definitely in full swing here. And you see it in everything from hats that say, make Gaza flat again, to bumper stickers that use Nikki Haley's line that says, finish them, to other signs where they've morphed pictures of members of Hamas with Adolf Hitler, with the implication, and they actually write, we must eliminate them. Underneath these signs. But it's not just signs. You hear it every day from politicians. You hear it on the news. And then you see it when you open up anything on TikTok. You see images of soldiers who are wearing women's lingerie, to people who are blowing up houses and dedicating it to their children, to a save the date that's written inside of a destroyed Palestinian home. And when I talk to people, they say, well, boys will be boys. Or when I ask them, what does win mean? Because that's the slogan that you see everywhere. They can't really answer it. And when I push further, they'll say things like, I asked my neighbor, 15,000 kids have been killed. And she shrugged her shoulders and she said, that's the price. So this genocidal fever is in respect to Gaza, but not only in respect to Gaza. We've seen that Palestinians who hold Israeli citizenship have been targeted for things that they've written on Facebook, on Twitter, and on
let me jump
Instagram.
in there. Let me jump in there because Tom Hall is asking specifically about that, Diana. He says, in her post, Diana spoke about Palestinians in Israel being arrested for speaking out against a genocide. Can you speak a bit about Israel's approach to regulating speech since October?
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. So it's been, most of it has been, I'll give you some examples. One is a very well-known folk singer, neuroscientist as well. She, on October 7th, wrote a post that said, there is no victor but God. Her name is Dalal Abu Amni. She was arrested and thrown in prison for 3 days. But the worst came afterwards. Since that time, there's been a protest in front of her house every day since the end of October, in which they call for her to be raped, to call for her to be expelled. The mayor of the city has participated. In fact, he spearheaded many of these protests. They even renamed her street IDF Street. And he ran his whole election campaign off of trying to get her and her husband, who happens to be a doctor, expelled from the city. But the way that most of this is regulated is that it happens to be your neighbors, the people you were in study group with, your colleagues, who are monitoring your social media posts and then reporting it to the police. And so we've seen people reported to the police for things like an image of a man sitting on top of rubble with a broken heart emoji over top, and that being interpreted as support for Hamas. We've seen just all sorts of these types of arrests happening across the country for just these very simple things. And again, it's important to note that this is coming sometimes from the police, but most of the time it's your former friends, your colleagues, your study group members who are reporting you to the police. At the same time, those who openly express genocidal statements are not at all being arrested or charged with anything.
Raz, Hisham Rana has an interesting question because Diana's talked about genocide fever in full swing. We've talked about kind of long-term impacts on Israeli society. Hisham says there have been some online stating that this invasion of Rafah is a last gasp push, much like the push in Lebanon on the eve of UN Resolution 1701 coming into effect. They point to next Tuesday's Independence Day celebration as a logical offboarding point for hostilities. I don't buy it, says Hisham. What do you think, Raz? Is there a sense that Netanyahu is trying to do a George Bush mission accomplished right now and try and kind of seize a victory, even though, the war's goals, destroying Hamas, freeing the hostages, have not been met, clearly?
I don't know. I mean, I don't know is the answer to that, obviously. But I think we need to take the genocide fever that Diana now described briefly very, very seriously, right? So it's not really about it's not just about Netanyahu, right? This is about Israeli politics and society, actually since the very beginning, right? We need to take this very seriously, even if this attack ends tomorrow, right? We still need to take this very seriously because this genocide fever is not going anywhere, actually. So there are millions of people in grave danger right now. So I don't know what's going to happen tomorrow or in a week, right? But I don't think that we should be focusing on Netanyahu in this kind of way, in the way that we're discussing this, right? As if it's all about Netanyahu the minute he goes to Palestine. This is a society now awash with war criminals and people who, with accountability, would be absolutely central here, right?
It's a very powerful and chilling statement to say this is a society awash with war criminals and genocide fever. Where does that leave the future in terms of, we talk about one state versus two states. If you have a society that is riven with people who have moved to the far right, this stuff can't be undone overnight. It's taken decades to get to this point. Can you have a quote unquote one state solution, Raz, in which Jews and Palestinians live side by side, Christians, Muslims, Jews are all in a binational, multinational, secular state? Is that even possible if the politics have shifted so far to the right on the ground amongst some of the Jewish members of society there?
I don't know. It's a very difficult question. The one thing that I can say from my perspective is that Israel is a society, and I grew up in Israel. Israel is a society that was built on this idea that the security of Jews is based on the insecurity and the oppression of Palestinians. Now, when in my own family, people are expressing genocidal language all the time, and I asked them, do you feel safe? Has this worked? Right? Has this worked? Right? The only way forward, right, is if you can even think about it as a very kind of Jewish-centric perspective if people want to think about it in that kind of twisted way, but nevertheless, right, the only way forward for Jewish security there is Palestinian security, right? So we have to have yes, we have to dismantle the Zionist state, by the way. Yes, it's illegitimate, right? Occupying state is illegitimate.
Can't say that, Raz. That's anti-Semitic according to the House of Representatives that just passed
not yet law, right? So let's see. But but we have to have a state that's based on the dignity, the sense of belonging of everyone, and the fact that everyone deserves the same kind of security and rights, right? We're very far from that, right? But I'm just saying that the idea of the state as it is now has not worked actually for the hegemonic group.
I'd love to be a fly on the wall of the Raz Segal extended family WhatsApp group. That must be an interesting discussion. Diana, Norshad Kasamali asks, talking about end of the war, if it even happens, what will Hamas and Fatah be able to work together when this genocide ends? If not, what will it mean for Gaza? I guess by extension, the Palestinian people.
They're already working together. And I think one of the tragedies has been that on the Palestinian side, we just haven't had a proper political leadership that's able to represent Palestinians in a coherent, cohesive way. But when you look beyond the Mahmoud Abbases and go down to the much more grassroots level, you see that whether Hamas, Fatah, Islamic Jihad, and otherwise, they are very much united. There aren't any Palestinians out there who say, yes, we want to live in refugee camps for the rest of our lives. Yes, we want to live under Israeli military rule and occupation. There definitely is a lot more that unites us than divides us. Unfortunately, we don't have that political representation that is able to bring them together, sadly.
Diana, you're in Israel. Anjali Zielinski asks, are the pro-ceasefire Israelis, like the hostages' families, are they getting more traction after Israel rejected this deal since Monday?
Yes, and yes. I think it's important to keep in mind that the people who are pro-ceasefire aren't necessarily pro-ceasefire because they want to see Palestinians living their lives and they want to see an end to the genocide. Many of them are pro-ceasefire because they see that the only way that Israelis have been released has been through a ceasefire, and that despite now 7 months of genocidal attack on Gaza, that nobody's been released as a result of these attacks. In fact, all that we've seen is destruction. So yes, we have seen over the course of the past couple of days, many more people who have taken to the streets who are demanding that this government step down and that demanding a ceasefire. I just don't see that that's going to translate into anything because there are equally high numbers on the right wing who are saying these genocidal statements like finish them, total annihilation, and then of course threatening to pull out of the cabinet.
And Maureen Purcell asks, you're mentioning the deal. The deal would involve Palestinian hostages, detainees being released. We're hearing rumors that Israel's willing to release Marwan Barghouti, a very famous Fatah leader, seen as super popular, especially in the occupied West Bank. We're also seeing reports that the PA, that Mahmoud Abbas doesn't want Marwan Barghouti released for obvious self-serving reasons. Maureen Purcell asks, will Barghouti be released? What do you think, Diana?
Inshallah. I can't see that in this climate, in the way that the United States has been carrying out this war with Israel, that they're going to be pushing for Marwan Barghouti's release. But there are still people who are indeed pushing for his release, including, again, members of Fatah, members of Hamas, members of the Islamic Jihad, and people who recognize that to continue to imprison Palestinian leaders indefinitely is to do exactly as Raz mentioned, which is to perpetuate this ideology that the only way that Israel can be safe is if Palestinians are unsafe.
And we're almost out of time, but we got to talk about the college protests. They have been historic. They have been cracked down in a shamefully historic way as well. Raz, you are a college professor. You're based out of near Philly. UPenn, Ivy League University, has been the scene of a lot of protests, chaos. A man with a big knife came onto the UPenn campus, didn't get much coverage because he didn't have a kafir and a big beard. He was on the pro-Israel side. Habiba Azab asks an interesting question. What do you say to people arguing that universities and the encampment are being funded by, drumroll, Qatar? And not just Qatar, we had Politico say this week they're being funded by, drumroll, George Soros, which is funny because apparently the protesters are anti-Semitic, but saying they're funded by Soros, some might argue, is an anti-Semitic conspiracy. But whether it's Soros, whether it's Qatar, you've been on the ground there. These college students, is this organic or is this a fake grassroots movement?
Absolutely organic, and this is so ridiculous. These accusations, and they serve a very clear purpose, right? Not to talk about an unfolding genocide, and not to talk about the very clear demands of the protesters, right? Who are, by the way, a very diverse group. They're Palestinians and Arabs and Muslims and Jews and Black people and others, right? And they have a very clear demand. We want our government to stop funding an unfolding genocide and supporting an unfolding genocidal regime. We want our universities to stop that, because in some cases, as in the UPenn campus that you mentioned, right, the company that develops the weaponized robot dogs that Israel uses horrifically in Gaza is on the UPenn campus, right? So students are saying, we want an end to this, right? Disclose university investments, right? Our tuition money as well, right? Yes. And then divest from Israeli genocidal violence and mass violence, right? Promote a ceasefire, right? Recognize truth. It's a university, right? Aren't we supposed to be committed to documented truth and research? So all these accusations about funding, from Qatar, or these anti-Semitic ideas about funding from Soros, they're ridiculous. And I want to say one more thing about this, which is important. The idea that the encampments are hotbeds of anti-Semitism somehow, right? This is a new level of intensification of the weaponization of anti-Semitism, because they don't actually recognize the many Jews in the encampments as Jews, right? And we're talking about Passover setters and Shabbat services and prayers in Hebrew and all.
You're dismissed as a token Jew when you speak on this subject. When I quote someone like you, Raz, I'm told you're quoting a token Jew, I'm told by Prose.
Right, right. And of course, Omer Bartov, if we think, is also a token Jew. And you mentioned before, I organized a statement of 60 Holocaust and genocide studies experts, 60, not one or two, 60, among them Israelis and other Jews, right, who all back in December noted the risk of genocide or the already existing dynamics of genocide and Israel's attack on Gaza, right? So, yeah, I mean, there's all kinds of ways to, sideline or blur or, but the point is that we need to continue to return the discourse to what's in front of us and unfolding Israeli genocide in Gaza and in full U.S. support, including the academic world now in the U.S., right? And this is, of course, tied to other crises in U.S. politics and society, but we don't have time to go to it. But these accusations against the encampments are absolutely ridiculous.
It's so interesting that I switch on my television and I'm told that these people on campus are all Marxists or jihadists. And then we have a discussion here on Zeteo and you say, actually, they want disclosure and divestment. It's pretty open what they want. There you go. You can get the truth or you can listen to propaganda. I'm going to give the last word to you, Diana, as a Palestinian in the Middle East, watching what's going on in the United States. What do you make of these college protests? How effective, how inspiring, how important are they?
There isn't a single person here who isn't talking about the amazing work that's being done on campuses. It is lifting us. We finally feel seen because when you live here, you feel very invisible. And so for the first time, we're actually seeing that this is what represents the United States, and not just the United States, but the world, that students have got it right. And it really does lift us. I just hope that it continues and that they finally listen to the students. As the world is talking about ethical investments and climate justice, you can't ethically invest in genocide. You can't believe in climate justice and allow for 65,000 tons of bombs to be dropped on the Gaza Strip. There's just no way. So this is very much lifting our spirits.
Diana Buttu and Raz Segal, thank you so much for taking time out for this breaking town hall that we just put together very last minute to talk about Rafah and also to talk about your brilliant piece. I urge you all who are watching at home to read Diana's piece. And I know you're all paid subscribers watching at home, and we appreciate you for your financial support. I would ask you all, there are several hundred people I'm just looking at in this chat. If I could ask just one favor, I'm sure you've appreciated this conversation. We want more people to join these conversations. We want more support for today. Just go away today. Get one person to become a paid subscriber to Zeteo, one friend, one family member. Raz is going to get his entire WhatsApp family group to sign up tonight as founding members. But I urge you all to support Zeteo. Word of mouth helps us a lot. So get your friends, get your families to sign up, and we will see you at the next town hall. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.